The afternoon sun bathed the busy downtown streets in a warm, golden hue, casting long shadows across the pavement. People hurried by, their faces a mix of concentration and exhaustion as they navigated the urban maze. The sounds of bustling traffic, the honking of horns, and the distant hum of city life created a soundtrack that seemed to drown out everything else. Yet, amidst the noise and rush, there was one man standing still at the corner, unsure of his next step. Mr. Harris was an elderly man, his posture stooped under the weight of years and countless untold stories. His cane tapped gently against the ground as he shifted his weight, trying to find the courage to cross the street. His steps were slow, cautious, as if every movement was a small negotiation with the world around him. The years had been kind to his spirit, but unkind to his body. His joints ached, and his knees trembled slightly with each shift in weight. The street before him was busy, too busy. Cars zoomed by, too fast. Pedestrians walked with a purpose, none stopping to take a second glance at him. He hesitated. He'd been standing there for what felt like ages, waiting for a break in traffic, trying to find the right moment to make his move. But the longer he stood there, the more uncertain he became. Every step across the street felt like a mountain too steep to climb. Just then, the soft hum of a car engine cut through his thoughts. A police cruiser, parked on the opposite side of the street, caught his eye. The officer behind the wheel sat idly, glancing around the street, likely just another routine patrol. But then, something changed. The officer's gaze fell upon Mr. Harris. Their eyes met for a brief moment, and something in that silent exchange sparked. Without a second thought, the officer opened the door of the car and stepped out. He wasn't in a hurry. There was no rush in his stride, no urgency in his steps. He simply walked across the street toward Mr. Harris. Officer Daniels was a tall, broad-shouldered man. His uniform was crisp, his posture straight, but there was an unspoken warmth about him. It wasn't just the badge on his chest that made him stand out, it was the way he carried himself. He wasn't the type of officer who stood apart from the people he served. He was a man who understood that every person had a story, every face a challenge. And in that moment, he noticed Mr. Harris. As Officer Daniels neared, Mr. Harris looked up, startled. His heart quickened, his fingers tightening around his cane. It wasn't every day that a police officer approached him, and it certainly wasn't every day that one seemed to take notice of him so directly. He shifted uneasily, unsure of what to expect. But Officer Daniels didn't make a fuss. He didn't offer any platitudes or say anything that could make Mr. Harris feel smaller than he already did. Instead, he simply smiled gently, his voice calm but filled with kindness. "Need a hand crossing, sir?" Mr. Harris blinked, caught off guard. He looked up at the officer, his eyes flicking from his cane to the steady gaze of the man before him. He wasn't used to such direct, quiet kindness. He wasn't used to anyone offering him help without asking for something in return. "Ah," Mr. Harris said, his voice trembling slightly. I don't know. I've been standing here for a while, but I'm not sure when it's safe to go." Without missing a beat, Officer Daniels stepped closer, offering his arm in a simple gesture of support. "Let me help," he said, his tone gentle but firm. "I've got you." For a moment, Mr. Harris hesitated. He wasn't one to ask for help. He hadn't been one to rely on others for years. But something about the officer's calm presence made it feel safe, made it feel like he wasn't a burden, that he wasn't taking more than what was offered. With a quiet sigh, Mr. Harris took a step forward, leaning slightly on the officer's arm. They moved together, side by side, crossing the street slowly. The cars whizzed by, and the crowds continued to move around them, but in that small moment, everything else faded. The world seemed to slow, and it was just the two of them, one man When they offering reached the silent other side of the strength, street, the other Mr. Harris grateful paused, for the simple act feeling of the weight of the compassion. moment settle in his chest. His heart felt a little lighter, the ache in his joints a little less painful. He looked at Officer Daniels, his eyes soft but filled with gratitude. "Thank you," Mr. Harris said, his voice quiet, almost unsure. "I don't know how I would have made it across without you." Officer Daniels simply nodded, a small, knowing smile on his face. "It's my job," he replied, his voice steady, but there was an undeniable warmth in his words. "But sometimes we all need a little help, right?" Mr. Harris smiled back, a fleeting moment of peace washing over him. He'd spent so many years feeling invisible, like the world had passed him by. But for just a few minutes, he had felt seen, felt that someone truly cared. It was a small thing, but in his heart, it was everything. As Officer Daniels turned to walk back to his car, Mr. Harris stood there for a moment longer, watching him go. The officer didn't look back. He didn't need to. The act of kindness had been enough. But as Mr. Harris stood on the corner, something inside him shifted. The world didn't seem quite as indifferent anymore. For the first time in a long while, he felt a spark of hope, hope that maybe, just maybe, there was more good in the world than he had thought. And perhaps it wasn't about waiting for the world to change. Maybe it was about showing up, being there when someone needed help, offering a small but meaningful gesture of kindness that could change everything. As Officer Daniels pulled away in his patrol car, the sound of the engine fading into the distance, Mr. Harris took a deep breath. He didn't feel so invisible anymore. He wasn't just the old man at the corner anymore. He was a man who had been seen, helped, and cared for. And in that moment, that was enough.